In this next chapter, what we're going to be looking at is working with CSS3 transitions. Now, there's a wonderful new feature inside of Dreamweaver that facilitates the use of CSS3 transitions. But in order to prepare for our look at that particular feature, I think it's best if we examine some of our existing CSS3 transitions and see how they work. You'll notice that if you're still working with the same files as last chapter, chapter 9, what I'd like you to do is to go to Manage Sites, and we're going to create a new site called chapter 10. So just give it that name. Then I'd like you to point to the local site folder, which is found inside of your source files. And the source files should point to chapter 10. Now, since we're going to be looking at both transitions and spry elements inside chapter 10, you can choose the chapter 10 folder as your main site. So now that this is our local site folder, we'll save this, click OK, and click Done. Now, within the Killer App section, you'll find a Start and Finished folder. Well, the one that we're going to be working with is the Start file. So it's not so much the index page that I'm concerned with at this point, but rather let's take a look inside of the Pages folder, and within there you'll find a number of files that we've been working with in the previous chapter. Let's double click the Contact page. Not much going on here, pretty much the same as what we saw before. However, let's just take a quick look in live view and see what this one looks like. Simple contact page and simple bits of information. However, what we're going to be targeting are the gray quote boxes that you see here in the aside section, and we're just going to make a simple little transition for them. But to begin with, let's also examine the fact that up to this point you've probably noticed that a number of your links that we've been working with do have a bit of a transition between the foreground first color that we have and the hover state color that we have. Notice that the hover state also says to underline the link, and in here that only appears, and as it appears it seems to fade into view. Well, in order to get a better sense of how this is done, let's take a look at our CSS file, layout.css. And if you do take a look at that, you'll see that if we were to scroll all the way up to our navigation section, you'll see that main nav a link has a number of simple bits of information. Now, when we were discussing in the previous chapter on creating horizontal links, we really just defined all the information up to this point, displaying it as a block, text decoration, padding, text align, and so on. However, I've also added this simple little comment in here, and this should say CSS3 transitions. And you'll notice that there is the inclusion of some information that you may not be familiar with at this particular point. Well, let's examine it a little bit closer. You'll see here that the A links inside of main nav are all set to begin with a CSS3 transition. And what this means is, inside of WebKit browsers, or Mozilla browsers, or Microsoft browsers, or even Opera browsers, there is the property called transition. Now, all of these do say pretty much the same thing, but we do need to add the prefixes before the transition property. And you'll notice also that at the very bottom there is a transition property that does not have a prefix. And this one is a little bit of forward thinking, that is saying eventually when these prefixes are not needed, we have the transition property to fall back on. Well, let's examine what exactly it is doing. Within the transition property, the value is saying all properties. This is what I want to begin to animate. So in other words, I'm not specifically targeting width or height or background color or any of those elements. I'm basically saying let all properties have the ability to animate and transition. The next value is 350 milliseconds, and this is a value that is dictating the speed of the animation. Now, this value can also be set in seconds, but this particular example says 350 milliseconds, which would equal about 3.5 seconds. The next value here says ease in out. Now, ease in out is really how the animation is going to take place. In other words, does it just take place as a normal animation with the same speed the whole way through, or as in this case, it will ease into its animation, in other words, slowly enter that animation, and it will also ease out of that animation. So the speed of the animation will slow down at the end of the 3.5 seconds that have been defined. Another way to think about the ease in out value is by imagining the USS Enterprise in the Star Trek TV series is entering into warp and doing so rather slowly and then quickly going into warp and eventually coming out of warp, slowing down as it eventually comes to its resting point. Something else that's added here is 0 seconds. Now the 0 seconds value here is really just to determine whether or not there is going to be a delay for this particular animation. And in this case, we don't want a delay. We want the animation to take 3.5 seconds or 350 milliseconds in time, and we want that to happen as soon as we hover over this value. Now that's how we get the second part of this animation transition to work. First of all, the CSS3 transition is placed, as you can see here, in the first state of our link. In other words, the A link looks like this, and it has the animation possibility. What's going to make that actually happen is by adding the pseudo class of hover to this A link. Now, it's not unusual for us to see the pseudo class of hover associated with links, but it may be something new to you to understand that the hover pseudo class can be placed on just about anything. So any definition that you can define in CSS, you'll be able to put a hover pseudo class on it. And what that means is the original state looks like this and is ready for an animation, but the hover state dictates what exactly the animation will look like in its end state. So a link here with the CSS3 transition information here is the beginning state of this transition, and the a hover pseudo class is the ending state of the transition. So originally this is the color. At the end, this will be the gray color. At the beginning there is no text decoration. At the end there happens to be an underline on the text decoration. So this is what we do to create CSS3 transitions, and as you've been seeing up to this point, that's how we got these links to do what they're doing right here. Now you might be wondering, does that mean I have to come and write all this information every time I want to create some kind of CSS3 transition? As you'll see in the next video, I'll show you how to use Dreamweaver CS6's new CSS3 transition feature, and it's going to make your life a whole lot easier.